many mics in the room? Just doing a mic check. Can you guys all hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Cindy, thanks so much for your talk, but I have to disagree. Cohort 13 is the best cohort ever. This is a really personal talk, so my goal is to just get in touch with the human side of you. I'm going to be talking about my mom. My mom was born in India 81 years ago today, and she spoke 5 languages. All of those languages were self-taught. She translated ancient Sanskrit spiritual works to make them more accessible to those who don't speak Sanskrit. My mom was also a ferocious tiger mom, before that concept was commonly used and vilified. She insisted on a multilingual house demanding precision with words and concepts. Priti, tell me the difference between the words fragrance and scent. And as a 9-year-old cub, I delivered my best definitions of both of those words. When we immigrated to America, my mom worked full-time as a CPA while she raised us, her 2 daughters, and taught her family English. At night, we were not to disturb her while she read the newspaper, dictionary by her side, bringing light to the words she did not understand in the Dear Abby column. She watched Wheel of Fortune while cooking dinner every night to immerse herself in the colloquialisms of American English. My mom was not just a tiger mom, but she was a tigress. And the thing she was ferocious about was education, both hers and ours. I recall in middle school when I told her, elated, that I had received the 2nd highest score on a science test. And she told me, in a tone of disappointment, doctors don't come in second, and especially in science. Those words from our tigress I will never forget. Some 40 plus years later, my mother was running a business alongside my father as a successful CPA. But about 5 years ago, I noticed small shifts in her behavior. She would ask reoccurring questions, her anxiety increased, and she started to lose items. And then finally, one day, she was unable to find her way home from the very office that she'd been going to for the last 40 years. At an appointment in June 2020, a diagnosis dropped like a bomb: Alzheimer's. I shouldn't have been shocked when I got the news, but I was. I was completely shocked. We were completely shocked. And I will never forget the moment in that exam room. It was too small, too cold, too sterile. I began to cry. Actually, that's not true. I did not cry. I wailed. I could not collect myself, no matter how hard I tried. My mother put her arms around me and held me tight. And she said, "It's all right, I'm here, I love you." Confession. I was so ashamed because I was the doctor and she was the patient and she was the one with the disease, and yet she was consoling me. Remembering that doctors don't come in second, I decided my mother would become my #1 patient. I went into what I call super doctor mode. I became her ardent advocate, making sure she would get the best care anywhere. Of course, I wanted to make sure her physical health was as ideal as it could be. I got the brain MRIs, the genetic testing, I checked her hemoglobin A1C to make sure everything was normal. I tactfully demanded a geriatric psychiatrist who said she wasn't taking any more patients to take one more tigress. And armed with a full panel of information, facts, and best practices, I could address any worry she had about her glucose, her brain imaging, or her genetic profile. And I was completely prepared to assuage her anxiety with any facts that she desired about the disease and the best ways to provide care. I told her how healthy she was, but sadly, her physiological health was not on her mind, and that surprised me. To me, in Gujarati, which is our first language, she said, "I'm worried. I've worked my whole life to really advance my knowledge of spirituality. What if I forget all my lessons? I want to be Sukhi." And that's when I realized this super doctor was going to need some language lessons. She wanted Sukh. I knew that word from childhood. Sukh is a word in Gujarati. It means contentment or satisfaction. For me, healthcare meant surveilling for sickness, and for her, healthcare meant securing her spirituality. So, instead of going to see yet another specialist, what she really wanted was to see Pujashri, her guru, to seek contentment. She expressed her fear that she would lose all that she had worked for, all that she had learned. She feared she would slide backward in her spiritual growth because her brain was not functioning. So, my dad and I set up a Zoom call for her to speak to Pujashri in India and her spiritual community. He eased her anxiety in a way that I could not. He told her, yes, she had an illness of the brain, and yes, there was no cure, and yes, she would forget things. But he told her she need not worry. The secret is that spirituality resides deep within the soul, and the soul never forgets. Our tigress was Sukhi. My mom was full of joy. I also knew my mom desired to stay at home independently with my dad and continue to have a sense of purpose. I wanted her to be safe, of course. To accomplish this, I did a lot of research. I did all kinds of crazy things. I took photos of the inside of every cupboard and drawer and taped them to the outside of each door so she wouldn't have to recall what was inside. I placed dimmer switches in every room to reduce bright light. I made the TV voice activated to her native language so that she wouldn't have to search for or remember how to use a remote. And when she could no longer remember how to wear a sari, I made her saris into curtains so she would be surrounded by familiar fabrics. I learned about Montessori methods, which were originally designed as a way to educate children, have now been used successfully to give a sense of purpose to patients with Alzheimer's. I used this to design a daily schedule and a curriculum for her with activities and with purpose. And then I remembered I was doing something else my mom had taught me. It's a word, this time in colloquial Hindi, and the term is jugad. It's a mentality, yes, all the Indians are nodding. It's a mentality of being a problem solver, negotiating adversity with improvisation and ingenuity. And to put it in very simple terms, it's being a life hacker. As my mom progressed, I saw all the ways she had cared for me throughout my life. When I was a child, she worked full-time and cooked a full Indian meal every night. When I became an adult, she cared for me on days when I had an early surgical start by taking my then infant son for overnights with his grandma, or what he officially calls her, Mamaji. I wanted to aspire to take as good of care of her as she had of me. And then I thought of another word she had taught me, and this time in Sanskrit, seva. Seva is the concept of selfless service that is performed without any expectation of result or award for performing it. To do this, I enrolled in a free virtual reality training called Embodied Labs. It was started by a young woman when she realized that her mother had early onset Alzheimer's. She wanted to convey what it feels like to be the patient. Using virtual reality and an Oculus headset, which is often used for gaming, I embodied a math teacher named Beatrice, who was dealing with Alzheimer's. I felt the fear, the confusion, the overstimulation, and the isolation of it. In that hour, with that headset on, I went through all the stages of Alzheimer's. I became Beatrice, but I also became something else. I became an empath. And it changed me and the way I took care of my mom. My entire family has done the training. Which reminds me of another story. 3 months ago, my son and her only grandchild, the one that had spent overnights with her since he was an infant, Paul, now 20, went to visit his beloved Mamaji. And as always, he entered the house and reached down to give my mother a hug. But this time it was different. It was the first time she didn't recognize him. She asked him to leave, and so he did. When I asked him how he felt about it, he answered, "Mom, I was worried that Mamaji was scared because she thought there was a strange man in her house." Not the answer I was expecting. I asked him, how did he come to this realization? He said, "Remember Beatrice? Remember how scary it was when she didn't know who her brother was? I didn't want Mamaji to be afraid." What I realized was my 20-year-old son had become an empath. Clinically, we've been using simulation and virtual reality to learn how to run a code or perform a surgery because we want to be technically better at our jobs. But what if we used it in the context of seva, to be in selfless service? What better way to serve a patient than to understand what it feels to be the patient? My mom's language lessons have served me well, and I hope they can serve us all well. We here in this room, super doctors that we are, have taken an oath. We are dedicated and passionate about helping patients and about making their lives better. We are also meant to be lifelong compassionate learners. And for those of you who do this next thing actively, I thank you. But for those of you who are like me, please allow me to share this one thing that I have rediscovered through this experience. Having been on the other side of the too cold, too sterile, too small exam room, I now understand the value of that oath, not just only to the patient, but to the caretakers as well. After we drop the bomb at the initial appointment, it's our responsibility to turn our heads to that wailing mother, to that lost father, to that broken brother or sister, and to that abandoned spouse and child, and explain to them that we as doctors and they as caregivers, because they've just taken on that mantle, will partner together to make this as bearable as possible, because caregivers need your care too. At the follow-up appointments, turn your heads and just ask, how are you coping? And likely, they will lie and they will say just fine. But they will know that the question was asked by you, and they will be seen as an ardent advocate, a life hacker, and an empath. Sukh, Jugad, Seva. So, my mom is no longer a CPA. She can't add anymore. Numbers are difficult. My mom doesn't cook anymore. She can't remember recipes. My mom can't read anymore. Deciphering is problematic. She can't speak 5 languages, and she doesn't teach us English. And my mom does not recognize me. But she's 81 today, and she's still a tigress and ferocious about education, and she still teaches me every day. She's taught me Sukh, Jugad, and Seva, and these lessons are part of my soul, and the soul never forgets. Thank you.